Good morning, everyone. Well, good morning for me. I don't know what time it will be for you, but it's nice to know that I go jogging with you every now and again and that sort of thing. Long may it continue. I want to talk about education today, but in a particular sort of way. Everybody who cares about their kids knows that the education they're getting at the moment is not feeding their souls. It's a very reduced view of the world. They're not reading great books. They're reading psychological novels from the 20th century that are all about screwed up people. And the great stories are not being told. They don't even know they're fairy tales. Read Chesterton's The First Chapter of Orthodoxy if you want to get a lovely take on why fairy tales are more important than modern novels. But that's not the point I'm making at the moment. We're just coming to the end of the academic year at Augustine College. So immediately after recording this talk, I'm going to be spending an hour or two with the students in my class doing what amounts to a final examination, which is viva voce, a live conversation. Can you talk about what you've learned? Because we have developed over my lifetime an approach to education which is laughable in the sense that it is a memorize and dump program. People don't sit down and ask, what do kids know at the moment? What do they need to know? What would knowledge look like? How do we make sure they get it? No, we sit down and make a list of things that we're proud of knowing, and then we teach them to them whether they can understand them or not. And we overload them with information, so the only way that they can deal with it is to memorize and dump, especially later on. Medical school's a classic example. I mean, I watched this process teaching biochemistry to medical students for years. The whole course was predicated on an idea which was not true, and that is that biochemistry can be understood by any reasonably intelligent person immediately. You might as well say anybody can walk into a room and speak French. No, they can't. They have to learn the basics of the language and get on with it, unless they have some natural abilities, which some people have. Well, there are a few students in the class who've actually done and understood biochemistry. They don't need the class. They should be given a pass. But the rest of them, they won't understand any of it, and they'll freely admit it in later years. So what are we actually doing when we examine in this way? Now, the move towards academic medicine, when it started, was due to the fact that doctors were profoundly ignorant and still operating on old-fashioned ideas when the big change began. And so it was reasonable, and the amount of science we actually had was not that great, so it was possible to take it in. Now, if you take leading-edge science, it's all about the exact characterization of the most recently discovered receptor in a particular disease. Nobody remembers that kind of stuff. I became aware of this when I started traveling around the continent and ending up lecturing in rooms where the guy before me had been teaching medical students, and there was a DNA sequence on the blackboard, which is utterly irrelevant to the medical student, but obviously it's what he'd been working on, and he thought it was important because it was important to him. So the question is, what do we really need to know? And the first thing, of course, is that we need to distinguish wisdom and knowledge. T.S. Eliot's wonderful line from Choruses on the Rock, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? We now have deans of medical schools who are proud of the fact that they're an information-rich environment. The only problem is that they're getting that information from unfiltered sources. And so they unless they're very well trained, they can't sort out the wheat from the chaff. But that's where we're at. And when we started Augustine College, we understood that they didn't have the basics in place. They didn't know the cultural history of our world. I mean, we weren't concerned with being multicultural or politically correct. We wanted the students to understand how they came to live in the kind of world they live in now, not by preaching at them, but by looking at what mattered to people over the centuries, starting from a few millennia before Christ. And it's been a very satisfying program, because I meet students all the while who say it was the most important 8 months of my life. Now, a lot of them have become, well, about over 10% of them are physicians now, and that's a great contribution. We've got quite a few professors too, although we've only averaged 12.5 students per year over nearly a 30-year period, because we're no good at advertising. The most important thing is that the kids leave with a realization that whatever they think about Christianity as a religion, they have to understand that it made the Western world possible. All the anger over Hamas and the like misses the point entirely. The Muslims were the most wealthy culture in the world for a good many centuries. They had some great scholars, but they didn't bother with education in any real sense. And there's nothing to show for it, except anger, which is crazy. When you led the world and you gave it away, anger is not the appropriate thing. Remorse might be better. But they don't even know their own people. When I'm traveling on an airplane and I happen to sit next to a Muslim, we end up talking about what I do. The moment I ask him about Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, he sort of stops dead in his tracks. He said, they're scholars, aren't they? There I am. I know more about two of the most important scholars in his history than he does, because he's not taught it. It's astonishing. And for the vast majority of ordinary Muslims, the guys who do apologetics for Islam, David Wood says of them that they can work on the 99% rule. That is, 99% of the people they talk to will take the word of a Muslim over the word of a Christian without even thinking about it. So you can't really have a debate unless you can find some way under their skin. They're insulated to a considerable degree. And they were very arrogant for many centuries, so they sort of started falling behind the West, and they didn't realize that the West had made progress in all sorts of areas, particularly militarily. When they lost their first major sea battle in the Bosphorus, it was a shock. But they were still threatening Europe, Vienna, in the 1700s, not that long ago. And they were pushed back largely thanks to, from the gates of Vienna, the intervention of the Polish king. And they haven't been back since. So all that kind of history is not known. And when you start talking about it, my aeroplane conversations, the people who travel on planes are usually somewhat sophisticated. So, for instance, I say, how do you handle the fact that you probably get rather more surveillance than, say, I would? And the usual response is ironic and right. He said, I'd be worried if I didn't, because people who travel a lot are not going to be swayed by theories. They're swayed by the facts. And they will say, look, all the people who've blown up planes in the last little while have been terrorists, and most of those terrorists have been Muslims. So I want surveillance to start from whatever starting point you can get that gets you into the bit of the pot that you really need to examine. That's where we're at. But we're not currently speaking truthfully about almost anything. And that's what needs to change. Now, the next thing that happened when we started the college was to realize, okay, they're losing their way in all sorts of respects because they're losing their foundations. I hadn't thought about what was happening. I'd simply observed it. I hadn't worked out at all what the problem was. But it became increasingly clear as we went along. And I think the simplest way that I can illustrate what's gone wrong is to say something I've said before, but it bears repeating because it's important. And that's Alan Bloom's comment in The Closing of the American Mind at the end, towards the end of the first chapter of the book. He's an unbelieving third-generation Jew in America who's one of the University of Chicago's best philosophers. When he wrote that book in the late 80s, he wrote it because the quality of students coming to him in Chicago were not what they used to be. And he didn't like the idea that he had to dumb down his classes. And, of course, the book produced outrage from the faculties of education and the like, but no destruction of his basic comment, his basic issue. And at the end of that first chapter, in describing his uneducated grandparents who'd never went inside an institution of higher learning, He said, nevertheless, their home was spiritually rich because they could go to the synagogue where they heard great scholars speaking, not from an alien perspective, not showing off as professors normally do, but simply providing guidance and going deeper. That, says Bloom, is what a community is, something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. Not any story will do. The story that you have determines what you get. At a first level of approximation, there are only half a dozen big stories in the world that will answer the big questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Death, suffering, justice, nature of knowledge, duty and ethics. Those questions need to be answered. The biggest story in the history of the world is animistic paganism, and it explains the world by reference to all the bad things coming from evil spirits who are local. There may be a distant God, but he doesn't care about us. But that story rooted in evil spirits as an explanation works in terms of giving people some sense of what life is like and being somewhat fatalistic. It gives them a fatalistic streak, which you need if you're going to lose half your kids before the age of puberty, which used to be the case until they were colonialized. No mention of that when people talk about the terrible things that colonialism did. Now, it also did a lot of good ones. And there are some people saying them. I love people like Coleman Hughes, black and honest and young, but he's a very lone voice, but he doesn't seem to mind taking the flack that he takes. Bloom is saying that narrative underlying your culture is absolutely critical. The Book of Nature, animistic paganism. Then you have East and West, and the difference is that in the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all believe in a creator God who has a predictable character in the case of the Jews and the Christians, but not in the case of the Muslims. Allah is entirely free to be arbitrary whenever he wishes. God is free too, but his character tells you what he will and will not do. And in the East, of course, you have meditation with the ultimate idea that you might get absorbed into the nothingness. Not great motivation for modern technological world. I mean, some great conceptual advances occurred in the East, but the great amazing change in the world from roughly the late 13th century onwards that led to reductive science, which has been incredibly successful. Too successful in one level, in that the philosophers are largely, as McIntyre points out, doing analytical philosophy, which doesn't help us in these things because it's trying to do the same sort of thing that science did. Whereas what you really need, in McIntyre's view, is to understand the best thinking that has occurred throughout the whole of human history. And that's not being taught anymore. The incredible impact of his book, After Virtue, that everybody has to deal with, whether they like it or not, in the philosophical area. And as far as I can see, nobody has taken his thesis down that we have lost our way, narrative-wise. We have no moral consensus. So where does that come from? How is it acquired in the Western world? Well, for the Jews and Christians, it was acquired by teaching the stories to the children. What you teach children is vitally important. The fact that Hamas has been teaching children the greatest thing a boy can do is kill a Jew, and that's on their website, and there's no question that's what they teach. They teach hatred of Jews. That's not going to lead to a productive society. And neither is the identity politics that we're doing in the university with affirmative action on the basis of identity groups, not on the basis of potential competence. Competence is the only thing that matters in the university, and certainly the only thing that matters when you go to your surgeon, your doctor, your engineer, anything that you have made. It's going to be interesting to see all this fuss with Boeing, what kind of company it was that they were buying the parts from that didn't have the checks and balances in place. It's not that they couldn't do it, it's that they didn't do it, and the question is why. They thought they could get away with it, I presume. If you believe that life has no ultimate meaning, what reason do you have to take excessive care, so-called? As long as you don't get found out, it doesn't matter. That's the problem with our Darwinian reduced world. is that if everything comes down to my genes versus yours, then there's no space for ethics. There's no space for morality. And yet deep down we know it should be there. And the easiest way to demonstrate that this has really gone down the tubes is to look at the metaphors that the students today do not understand. The only way we can talk to one another is via metaphor. We need word pictures to explain things. And the difficulty is that until relatively recently, certainly when I went to school, it was still the old world. It's not anymore. So it all fell apart basically in the 60s. Read Tom Sowell if you want to get detailed historical accounts of all the important aspects of modern North American and European life started going down in the 60s. Crime was dropping until the late 50s. So what happened in the 60s has got all sorts of ramifications. But one of the things that happened in North America is that the activists for multiculturalism managed to squeeze the Bible out of school on the grounds that it was not multicultural, which it's not. But that meant all the narrative stories were removed. So on my website, for those of you who haven't been there, johnpatrick.ca, you can find a test of biblical literacy. About 40 or 50, I can't remember the exact number, of phrases that all have a biblical root, but the phrases are presented to you as they appear in English literature. So to take a very current one, in that list is eyeless in Gaza. And it is the Gaza where all the fuss is going on at the moment, Gaza. But of course, eyeless in Gaza, when I went to school, would immediately bring to mind a particular story. And that's the story of Samson, who had been finally captured and emasculated, in effect, by cutting off his beard, as it happened, and blinded, kept in prison for the Philistines to make fun of fairly regularly. Anyway, they were having a feast in one of their biggest buildings, and they sent for Samson to come in so they could enjoy watching him feel around to get anywhere and the like. And the boy who was leading him, he said, "I want to feel the pillar at the middle of the house, the temple." And he prayed for the return of his strength. And although he was eyeless in Gaza, it says he killed more Philistines in his death than he had killed in his life. Philistine is one of the possible derivations of Palestinian. None of that is known by a modern student. Even Christian students, by and large, will not get that one. That means they've been robbed of their cultural history. That's very dangerous. Because when you have a cultural history, you have a huge amount of tacit knowledge. By tacit knowledge, I mean things that you know but you can't explain. So I grew up in an environment where the tacit moral knowledge was derived from the Bible, which was read in school every day. And so the Ten Commandments, for instance, were not in dispute. Everybody accepted that they defined who we were in many ways. They didn't think of it in those terms. They just didn't dispute them. God said them, they must be true. That was a very safe environment. No attacks on women, no theft to speak of, a lot of cooperation. We didn't lock our doors, although it was the British equivalent of Detroit. I have to go on saying that till eventually the penny drops. The way that was created was because the Brits had the sense to keep the Bible in school. Now, they did it for cultural reasons, they said, and they're right. You can't understand Shakespeare if you don't know the King James Bible. There are so many phrases in there which directly rely upon you knowing the King James Bible for their effect. And ordinary people could go and listen to Shakespeare's plays and they got the point. Whereas now university students say they don't want to read Shakespeare, they can't understand it. And they're right, they can't understand it. They pick up only a fraction of what's there. If they did go further, they would keep going back because the fraction would be obviously important. So that's where we've got to. So we have majored in information and we have lost wisdom. What is wisdom? You can ask all the young people in your families, those of you who are listening, how often have you heard wisdom spoken about in the university? And the answer will, in most cases, be, I've never heard the word. And they've certainly never felt wiser at the end of a lecture than they did at the beginning. Or very, very, very rarely, it's something that makes a lecture absolutely outstanding in your life. I'm astonished when I get responses to a lecture that was recorded in the University of, Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin, or nearly 20 years ago. But it was about the wisdom of the Hippocratic physicians and what they understood. I get emails from people who said, I was there when you gave that lecture, or I've come across that lecture. I've never heard this stuff before. That's sad. I mean, Hippocrates and those polytheistic pagans, and they are multicultural. There's no objection to them at first sight, except when you see they recognize the necessity of transcendence for a stable society. If there is no fear of God, then there will be no justice, because ultimately the judges will be corruptible, as we are seeing. The judges are supporting their own narrative, the narrative of the people they belong to, primarily. That's terrifying. I mean, we've just had an autistic woman in her 20s given permission to be killed because she says, my life is not worth living. No discussion by the judges of what impact this would have on society as a whole. No discussion even that there might be some reason to expect of people certain forms of acceptance and stoicism for the general good. None of it. Just, yes, you have that right. Off you go. Get yourself killed. Killing for mental reasons is really accelerating, particularly in Belgium, I'm told. I haven't looked at the figures recently. This is a world that's frightening. When we started the course at Augustine, I insisted that my course couldn't just be the history of science and medicine. It had to be related to faith, because the activities of medicine have behind them the whole idea of what a doctor ought to do, and you can't get that from physical science. Physical science never tells you what you ought to do. So later this morning after this talk, I'll be talking to my students this year to see how much has gone into their heads that they might carry with them. I'm not interested in reading a textbook to students. They're better off reading it. And I think one of the best attacks we could have on the current education system is to go after the textbooks, find out which are the best ones, and say, look, we ought to find people who can question the students who have read this textbook and see if they've understood it. And if they have, then okay, they should get a pass. And if they haven't, the people who are examining them say, no, look, you need to understand this and this and this. Now go and read it again. I think you could train for almost any of the things, the professions, law, medicine, the church, by having a set of books that everyone agreed were solid. They might not like the position of the writer, but he was an honest writer. He would deal with both sides of the argument, and not have memorize and dump exams. My exam today for these kids will depend. I know I'm lucky I've got good students this year. There's not going to be any doubt that they've understood it more than enough to get the pass they want, but I want to imprint things a little bit more. We don't need to take highly intelligent kids and make them jump through hoops. I think Peterson says if you had only one test, you do an IQ for university entrance. It would save you stealing the money from at least 25% of the students who go to university, probably much more, but at least 25%. We're holding our nose and taking their money. They're not going to get anything out of it. We all know that. The university knows that. Parents and students still are somewhat hopeful, but they're not going to get their money back. They're not going to get anything back. In fact, we probably depressed and demoralized them. So I want to do away with curricula. If a professor doesn't know what matters in his area, he shouldn't be teaching at all. But if we went to a textbook-based approach where you had to read the textbook, now you can't do an exam because they'll cheat. So there's got to be a means to filter down the numbers to a reasonable amount, and then have people who we can trust who would have the right to sign them off on any given subject. Certainly, I've had medical students, the best ones I've had, I'm thinking of 3 of them who are all professors and all black actually, who I would, if I'd had them as students, I would have let them free on patients in less than a year. Still under supervision, but they had good minds. They were well brought up, as it happened as well. So they would have been fine. That's the way we used to learn apprenticeship, and I think we need a lot more apprenticeship training because it's a place where you can pick out whether this person is trustworthy or not, and that is critical. So how this is going to turn out in the next little while, I don't know, but I'm going to do my bit in terms of how I evaluate and how I set out to give the students a sense of how science came to be. Given that we get mainly students on the more artistic end of the spectrum, a few who want to go into science, but even the ones who go into science, when they arrive, can't answer the question, how did experimental work begin? What are the prerequisites for doing an experiment? Who did it first and where? Was it acceptable to the society in which they lived or not? Why did it, in fact, inductive reasoning, which a lot of modern people want to pretend doesn't happen, but is at the heart of all experiments, only put its roots down in Western culture? Those who, they say, the anti-colonialists say they want to go to pre-colonial science. The only problem is there wasn't any. But they don't know that. They think the witch doctor is scientific. They actually say so, but he's not. He's empirical, and he's a very good toxicology. He's usually very good at killing people, and he's also capable of curing some people, but it's all empirical. Never got to the stage of beginning to understand at a physiological level how the body worked and how disease worked. So what are going to be the issues that I'm going to be asking these kids since they're on their way? They're coming to my farm for half a day to do this. One of the questions I'll ask them, why was it that it wasn't until the 1860s that it was actually worth going to a doctor if you wish to be alive at the end of the experience? Up until the 1860s, the people who didn't go to the doctor lived longer than the ones who did. It's really rather surprising, but it tells you something very important about medicine, which doesn't matter so much for other bits of science. We all know when we are sick, seriously sick. You say, I don't feel right. That's not an uncommon presentation. Something's wrong. And if you had the money, you'd go to the doctor, because although they had virtually no treatment until the 1860s, they were good observers and they kept records. So they could say, oh yeah, I've seen this before, or there's a lot of this going around. They would give you a prognosis. They would tell you what's going to happen. That's what you went for. You didn't go for cure because they didn't have them on the whole. A few things they could do, but very few. But they could normally tell you, yeah, I know what this disease is. I've seen it before. They might not have understood it properly, but they recognise what was going on. You can't help but learn those kinds of things. So that's why doctors were appreciated even when they were incompetent, because they were not incompetent at prognosis. That helps. Now, if you're going to the doctor for a prognosis, you're not. The other thing you're concerned about is, can I trust him? That's the critical thing. What's the relationship between you and the physician? Nowadays, all physicians are classified by the bureaucrats as being equally valuable if they've got this appropriate bits of paper, which is a load of old rubbish. But that's what they need to believe, otherwise they can't control the system, and they desperately want to control it. We have to reduce the bureaucratic load in medicine. We've now got in Canada to the state where we have more bureaucrats than we have doctors. Now, that used not to be the case at all. My first move, if I was in charge, would be to say every bureaucrat in a hospital must have his office on a ward, not in a separate place with better coffee and everything else. They're serving the patients like everyone else. They can work from an office on a ward where they can be asked to go and fix the bureaucratic things that come up. They can actually not only come to terms with the fact that they should be servants, but it's good to serve other people. That would help a lot. I mean, so many units in a hospital have minimal capacity to adjust their budget, so they don't require a lot of bureaucrats to run it. If you're running the feeding system for a hospital, the amount of change you can make in the meals for a day is pretty minimal. Cutting down the bureaucrats and having the ones that we do have being extremely well trained to understand the problem of running a really big organisation like a health system, that would be a good step forward. The nurses are also being abused in a similar way to the doctors. I have a son-in-law who's a very good physician. He spends 3 hours before a clinic preparing for the clinic because he has to sort out the X-rays, the MRI, the scans, and see that all the data's there. This is ridiculous. I never had to do that. When you went to the clinic, there were clerks and other people who made sure that all the information you needed was available. And if you didn't, the nurse running the clinic would know who to call immediately so that she could get them. Doesn't need to make the doctor do it. And that's simply because the people are transferring the costs from one budget to another. But you're killing your doctors. If you want a joke at the beginning of a grand rounds in a hospital anywhere in America, you can say, how many of you have not thought about retiring in the last week? And there's a laugh immediately because the answer is everyone has. That used not to be the case. Doctors were famous for the fact they didn't know how to take a holiday. They'd go on holiday and prop up the bar for 2 or 3 days and then go back to work because they loved their work. And loving your work is highly motivating. But, so we're going to talk about those aspects. How does medicine and science actually fit into a bigger picture? The fact that Christians have made a huge contribution to science, and so have Jews. If we took out from our society all the things that the Jews have produced for us, we would be deeply impoverished within 24 hours. There's so many things that all these people, young people shouting silly slogans, don't know about. It would be lovely to say anything made by a Jew or invented by a Jew or discovered by a Jew, take it away. Take Einstein's work out. So no modern physics. If you put in Christians as well, you've totally destroyed it because Faraday, Clark Maxwell, Einstein all believed there was a God. And between them, they're the foundations of modern physics to a very large degree. And there are many others still in that same category. It would be an interesting experience to do a documentary, but no modern filmmaker would do it. Imagining a society, what a society would be like if everything invented by a Jew disappeared overnight. It would be a very different world. And we wouldn't be better off for it. In fact, I used to say, and it's still true, if you land in a city and you don't know anybody and you need a doctor, the best sort of first level approach you could have is to go and find a Jewish one. In general, they have high ethical standards and they're competent. That's the world we live in. So I hope this provokes some response from people who are listening. I actually have and haven't used them. 14 questions I'm going to ask my students about what they've learned in 8 months on science, medicine and faith. And if there's some responses from you, I might tell you what they are next time or a time after this. But thank you, guys, for listening, and thank you for the occasional encouragements that I get from you that it's worth doing and worth continuing.